Okay, I'm late. I'm having a malfunction with my camera. It was on there and then it fell. I had to move it like 5 times. So, I'm up. But anyway, so long time no see. Like I said last time, my goal had been to be on here a little bit more. Life has not permitted that. It's been crazy. Very, very busy outside of work. Just it's kind of been a go, go, go thing. Just constantly busy. And so, as much as I've tried, it has not been where I really could. I've been able to post a little bit, but not really go live like I had anticipated. And then with the holidays, it's actually been easier to get on today just because I've been off of work and had a little bit of time between yesterday and today to be able to do that. So, and the plus side of that is yesterday I had already been having something that the Lord had laid on my heart that I've been dwelling with but couldn't really put into words. And so how that managed to work itself out was I'd been struggling with putting it into words and been praying about it, and there was a appointment that my son had. And during that appointment, the doctor had me present and was trying to explain something to my son, and he wanted me there when he did it, and the way that he was like explaining it to him, but then he kind of like check in with me and be like, Mom, am I doing okay? And I'm sitting there like, yeah. But as he's talking, I'm like, you just totally blew my mind. And by the time he was done talking and asked me how he did, I'm like I already knew what he was saying because I'd already understood it, but he was just trying to put it in kid terms. And for some reason, even though it was something I already knew, it completely took something I was dealing with and made sense of it, even though he was making sense of something completely different. And I was like, wow. And what he had done completely opened my eyes about the thing I had been struggling with. And so I want to share a couple things with you guys and kind of touch base on what's been going on kind of with me, and then kind of go back and forth, because I know with what I'm dealing with are things that us as humans deal with anyway. And so I'm going to kind of go back and forth a little bit on what I'm dealing with, because I know, like I said, it's something you guys are going to be dealing with too. I'm going to be messing with my hair because it's driving me nuts. Anyway. So, when I posted earlier, I had asked if you knew what our most basic human right was. This is something that he had asked my son and I when he was talking to us. And so, my son answered, and my son's answer was freedom of speech. Whenever he said, what is our most basic human right? My son's first answer was freedom of speech. And he said, well, that's a lot of times what everybody's answer is. It's a great answer, but no, it's not the right answer. And even I was kind of like, huh. And so then he asked what I thought, and then I was like, well, freedom of religion, I guess. Like, that was the next thing. If it wasn't freedom of speech, like, I didn't really know, because I really thought it was freedom of speech. So he also said, great answer, but no. And I was like, okay, now I'm lost. I don't really know. And he said, the freedom to protect ourselves. And I kind of sat there and I looked at my son, and he was kind of like, oh, I mean, I guess that makes sense. But we were both kind of like, that wasn't really the answer that came to either one of our minds at first. Just because, you know, the hot topic always is freedom of speech for the majority of America. And so, as I'm kind of sitting there dwelling on this answer, he's beginning to explain it to my son. And one of the things that stuck out to me was the next question that he asked. He asked, what do we call someone who can't protect themselves? And we both sat there. We didn't have an answer anymore. And I mean, I'm sitting there trying to grasp all the knowledge that I have, and I just cannot. I think it's simple, but I just can't pull it out. And finally, he gives us the answer, and he says, we call them slaves. And after he said that, I think I pretty much quit listening to anything else that he had to say. Because in my mind, it completely answered some of the things that I had been dealing with, which was this. When you are dealing with drama and something is going on in your life, and most of the time when things are not going right or things are going terribly wrong, it's not just because of a thing, it's usually because of another person. And whatever circumstance there is, it's other people that are involved. And so when he said that protection, that instinct to protect your family, that right to protect ourselves is what makes us a slave or not a slave. And so when he said, when you can't protect yourself, that basically makes you a slave, I began to think very hard on what I had been dealing with. And in my mind, I realized I had become a slave to a lot of things. Over my lifetime, I have struggled with being a slave to fear. I know that's a big one for a lot of people. There are people that are slaves to drugs, slaves to alcohol, slaves to anxiety. I'm one of those people. Slaves to fear. We all deal with some kind of slavery to something or person. And for me, I just could not let go of what he said. When we can't protect ourselves from something, because that's our basic human right, is to protect ourselves, and when we can't, we are a slave. And it hit the nail on the head, and I knew the Lord was answering what I was struggling with. And so I began to look up a lot of things to try to make sense of some of these struggles that I'm having. And I feel like I'm going to be all over the place, so I'm going to apologize. I do have notes. And now that I recognize that no notes can mean a long video, and a lot of notes can mean a long video, it's up in the air. So, here we go. The word slave dates back into like the 580 AD. 580 AD. Hope that makes sense when you're listening to it on the video. But the word slave actually derives from the Slavic people. And so I want to kind of lay that out there, but I don't want to go back to it just yet. But I want to give some descriptions of the word slave, because there are different definitions for it, and I'm going to kind of go off of different things with that, because there's a lot of points I want to make, which were points that I was kind of hanging on to and didn't really realize that it was alluding to the word slave, just things that I was dealing with. And so one of the definitions of the word slave is one who is subject to or controlled by a specified influence. I've heard the term narcissist for years. It's been used to describe some of the relationships that people like me have came out of or grown up in, and it's been used to explain PTSDs and things like that people like me and others have struggled with, and people will describe that when you've grown up in a narcissistic family or had a narcissistic relationship of some sort, these are kind of that explanation. You're subject to a controlling relationship. And so whether it's a parent or whatever, you are subject to that. And so the reality of it is I think about that when I think about narcissists. That's that controlling relationship. But we've heard the terminology controlling relationship, narcissism, but that definition ends up coming to slavery. And I had never put those two together. And that really hit hard, because as I thought about those relationships and then came to this definition and saw those words, I was like, oh my gosh. And the influence those relationships had on my behavior now and the things that I'm subject to as far as how I make my decisions, it's influenced my lifestyle now, even though I'm not subject to those people and those relationships anymore. I base a lot of the decisions I make on the behaviors I had to live with in order to get by. And so that became influential in how I got by in my life and now how I'm living my life. And so that kind of played a factor. And so when I started looking up the definitions of slave and saw that, I was like, that's making some sense, which really told me that God had a lot to do with that conversation yesterday. But some of the other definitions of slave is one who is owned as the property of someone else, especially involuntary servitude. Also, one who is controlled by another or works extremely hard. I don't always look at that as a bad thing. You know, I've heard people say they slave over the stove. I know that I joke about that sometimes when I'm baking to sell some of my pumpkin rolls or whatever to help me make my bills. And it's like I've been slaving over the stove or slaving in the kitchen. I don't really look at it as a bad thing necessarily, but it's been, productive. So in that sense, I never thought of it as a bad thing. However, it can be if it's something that's controlling your life. But there's a lot of extremes in here. It says works extremely hard. And a lot of it is a work or hard or extreme. None of them are really light terms. They're very hard, and they are extreme terms. They're controlling. They're owned, and they're in a sense all negative kind of terminology that's involved in servant or slave. And so those are your basic terms of it. And so there were some specific things that I looked up when it came to that. And I feel like I'm going to be jumping around a little bit. One of the things I want to touch on, I'm going to go back to the Slavic term really quick to kind of touch on something before I go to some specifics that I want to use as references. But the root word is an Indo-European word from the Slavics. And slave, the root word in the Indo-European term was kleu, K-L-E-U. And the meaning of that was to hear. As a servant, your only job is to hear what you're being told. You do it. You hear, you listen, you follow those directions. That's it. So your job is to hear. When I saw that and thought about it, and I think about influence and how I talked about how it influenced my behavior in those relationships, anything that I heard, even to today, I'm not in those relationships, but when I hear certain things, it will cause me to react in a certain way. It's a trigger for me from my past to react a certain way or behave a certain way, because when I was in those relationships that were not good, I had to behave a certain way because there were repercussions if I didn't. And so, in this sense, when I hear things now, I may react in a way that isn't healthy because it's what I do to survive. I work on that now with different kinds of therapy and praying, because I don't want to be that person anymore now that I'm not in that relationship. However, when I think about the fact that that means to hear, that's what causes that influence. And when you look up the definition of influence, it's the capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of someone or something, or the effect itself. So the influence on somebody, which when you're a servant, you have a specified influence as the person controlling. You control and have an influence on that servant or slave. The influence is you're affecting their character, their development, and the behavior of them. The outcome that is their life, you affect. And so, as I say, that word slave comes from the root word to hear. What you hear, you end up becoming, because when you hear certain things, it's influenced you at a point in time when you were a slave to that, to react a certain way. And that influenced your development into your character. And undoing that stuff is very difficult, and without God's help, you just cannot get past your past. And so, as I looked at all of this, it became very evident for me that getting over some of these things is going to be very difficult, especially when it's constantly presenting itself every few days because of my current situations. I can't just easily forget the things that I've gone through because I'm being presented with those situations on a fairly regular basis. It'd be nice to forget them because I've forgiven them, but unfortunately I can't forget it because I'm not being allowed to at the moment. And so as I began to do some studying, I have this book that was given to us by a close friend a while back. And some of the things in it I really enjoy because it's America's God and Country, and it's an encyclopedia of quotations. One of the things I like about it is it's got a lot of famous people in it and quotes, just important quotes. I mean, some of them may not be important to some people, but I really enjoy quotes, especially certain ones. And most of these are Christian quotes of some sort. But one of the first ones, and the majority of these, I kind of held to a standard of having to do with slavery in a sense, because that's kind of the topic that I was leaning on here. But there were two men in particular that I wanted to kind of talk about for a minute, because of some of the things they said and the points that they made. And the first one is Henry Ward Beecher. Some of the quotes that he made, and this one is one of my favorites. It says, "Sink the Bible to the bottom of the ocean, and still man's obligations to God would be unchanged. He would have the same path to tread, only his lamp and his guide would be gone. The same voyage to make, but his chart and compass would be overboard." Whenever, I think this one I really enjoyed because there were two ways that I looked at this particular quote. There is a passage that I marked, which is John 15:15. And summing it up, it says, the slave doesn't know what the master is doing. And as a servant of Christ, I don't know when Jesus is returning. I just know that he is. Now, you can get rid of my Bible and all of that. I am still going to serve Christ, but you've got rid of my map. And I know where I'm headed, and that's great. It's just I don't have my directions to get there anymore. And for me, I'm kind of like, well, that's a unique analogy, and I love it. But at the same time, like, I also think about how some of that's got some of the things about God in there, and so I'm not going to know some of the ways that God thinks and stuff because you've done away with my Bible. Now, as his servant, I'm like, well, I don't have any of that to kind of go by anymore, but I'm still serving him, even without what I need to really know him. But regardless, it's meaning a completely different thing. But I love that quote because I'm still going to follow him. You've just done away with what I need to really be able to follow him well. And it's just a unique quote I really like. The main thing that I had marked that he said in here, and it's a longer quote, but the main sentence that he started out with was, Christianity works while infidelity talks. I highlighted that one specifically with slavery because when I'm talking about slavery, I'm talking about our slavery to all of these things and even other people, because when we are dealing with controlling relationships or people that are manipulative, that do things to hurt our relationships with others to where we're bound to them because they're either that selfish or whatever, controlling or whatever the case is, we have that where they're trying to manipulate the situation. And so when that happens, I look at this particular quote as, we're still doing our job as Christians, but while we're doing it, we're sinners ourselves, but those that are not saved are still going to be doing what they do. They're still going to be talking and doing the things that are destroying us and trying to destroy our reputations as Christians. They're not going to stop, but we're still going to keep working. So that doesn't mean that we stop doing what we're doing. And the more we do good, the more they're going to beat us up. It's a hard pill to swallow, but that's how it works. The rest of the quote says, she feeds the hungry, clothes the naked, visits and cheers the sick, and seeks the lost, while infidelity abuses her and babbles nonsense and profanity. By their fruits ye shall know them. For me, this is, and I'm going to try to keep it together without crying. This quote hits home really hard for me. I try very hard to keep doing all of these things because I am a Christian and I want to keep doing everything that I can to do good and serve God. But in the midst of all of that, that does not mean that Satan doesn't use others. Doesn't mean he doesn't use other Christians to consistently try to attack the good that I try to do as a Christian. This quote talks about how she does all these things, but in the midst of it, infidelity still abuses her and babbles nonsense. That babbling nonsense, I can't even tell you how much it hits the nail on the head. In the midst of everything that has gone on in my life, I've had to be where I just don't have a whole lot of contact with people. Not because I don't want to, but I'm just in that spot where I can't. legally, and it's frustrating. It's exhausting emotionally because I don't have a support system like normal. I can't wait till the day that I can. But in the meantime, I have to keep myself going through the Word of God and prayer and what church services I can go to or watch online because the situation I'm in. And it's frustrating. But I look at quotes like this and realize that this is back from, oh goodness, 1887. Which means this stuff has gone on for hundreds of years. I'm not the only person. It gives me some hope. I know there's scriptures in the Bible that talk about people going through these things, that our fellow brothers and sisters deal with stuff just like we do. So I have that hope to know that I'm not the only one, and it's not going to last forever, but it is frustrating and it's very hard. So, apologize for the tears. I was trying really hard to keep it together. Anyway, my other one was kind of connected to that, and it's by Lyman Beecher. And he has an autobiography, and in that, he hits on our fellow Christians, which is a little bit more tough than having to deal with those that are not saved, but how they affect us. And he says the enemy employs influential friends of Christ to wound one another and to propagate distrust, alienation, and acrimony. Before I even finish, he used the word influential. That influence that I talked about, it is there. And he even used that word. And mind you, this was 1863. This isn't old news. This is something that has gone on that Satan has used consistently. So, influential. And not to mention, he's talking about friends of Christ to wound one another, to cause distrust. I am dealing with tons of distrust between my own friends, my own family, and alienation. I'm dealing with that right now. The majority of us are alienated from each other. It's frustrating. He goes on to say the strength of the church depends upon our concentrated action. Whatever, therefore, propagates suspicion and distrust among brethren who have long acted together paralyzes their power. Of this, the great enemy of the church is perfectly aware and has never failed. When the concentration of forces against him had become too formidable for direct resistance, to ease himself of his adversaries by dividing them. Our Bible tells us that that's what he does, is divide us so that it's easier to conquer us. Yet, we allow him to, and we're very quick to allow that division between ourselves so he can come in and divide. And I've watched it happen time and time again, and I'm living it at the moment, and it's frustrating. But right now, I rely on God to keep me going. I don't have any other choice. I know that if nothing, I had nothing left, I've got God. That's all I've ever had. So, I can rely on that, but God doesn't want us alone. He's always said throughout his word that we need to have each other. He didn't mean for us to be alone. And so, us being divided like that is Satan's plot to get us in a spot where he can destroy us. And so us allowing that to happen is our fault. And we need to be able to stop it. We just don't act. One of the other things here is oh goodness. So before I even touch it, I'm going to explain something else that was explained to my son and I yesterday that I had not really thought of in the sense that I had to yesterday. And I feel like I need to share it to make this make a little bit of sense, I think. So, the way that he explained it is there are some people in our life that are kind of like a fire. And disregarding them being like a fire and thinking about a fire itself. If we wake up in the middle of the night and our house is on fire, that basic human right to protect ourselves says there's 5 people in the house, including ourselves. We have the right to run out of the house while it's on fire to save ourselves, call 911, and wait on help to come and rescue the other 4 people. Now, there are some people in the world who would go back inside and rescue the others, or as many of the others as they could. And they might die trying, or they might not. We don't know. But those people we call heroes that do go back in there. But what do we call those that don't go back in there? Those that go and they call 911 for help and they wait till help comes. We call them normal. They have the right to protect themselves and wait for help to come save the others, because they don't have to go in and save the rest. It's their human right to save themselves and call for help for the others. They're not required to go back in there and save the rest of the people. They can save themselves. But if they chose not to, we can't be mad at them, because they're doing what is safe for them. Now, if they were to go back in there, yes, we would call them a hero. If they died going back in there to try to save somebody and maybe didn't, we'd still call them a hero. However, looking at a person that causes destruction like a fire, and people choosing to stay away from you because the person that's like a fire could consume their family, so they choose to stay away from your family since that's who the fire is after. Do we get angry at them because they've chosen to wait outside for help to come? No, they're normal. Do they come in and rescue you like a hero? We can't be mad at them if they don't. So, being mad at those who aren't sticking around while there's a fire going on is not something that I can really legitimately be upset about. I can understand that it hurts, and it hurts my kids. However, I have to understand that not everybody's a hero, and heroes are very rare. And when the fire is out, those people that were protecting their family will come back around. So I understood that aspect finally when he explained it that way. Some people are heroes, but just because they're not a hero doesn't make them bad. It just makes them normal. That was a very unusual concept to try to grasp, because for me, it's a no-brainer. If my house was on fire, of course I would go back in and get everybody out, probably including the dog. If I saw my neighbor's house on fire, yeah, I'd call 911, but I'd also go in and try to rescue them, because that's what I do. But then there's people that don't do that. And because I am not one of those people, it does make it hard for me to grasp that. But I understood what he was saying yesterday, finally. And that hero concept made an impact on some things that I read. So, I'm going to read some other quotes, and then I'm going to go to scripture. So J. David Whittaker Chambers, he was an American journalist. There's a little bit of reading here, but he said, freedom is a need of the soul and nothing else. It is in striving toward God that the soul strives continually after a condition of freedom. God alone is the insider and guarantor of freedom. He is the only guarantor. External freedom is only an aspect of interior freedom. Political freedom, as the Western world has known it, is only a political reading of the Bible. Religion and freedom are indivisible. Without freedom, the soul dies. Without the soul, there is no justification for freedom. So, when I was trying to wrap that into this whole thing, when I kept seeing freedom, I kept thinking hero. We don't have freedom in America without some heroes sacrificing their lives, number one. And we cannot really understand that freedom from slavery, from others, from fear, from drugs, from alcohol, from anxiety, from whatever it is, we don't have that freedom without God. We can claim to have God in our lives, but it's very difficult to really stand solid in that if we're not bearing fruit and if all we're doing is causing destruction. And so this freedom that he's talking about, we can't even have external freedom if there's no freedom internally. And I won't even get into the religion and freedom are indivisible, because that's a whole other subject. Anyway, the last thing that I wanted to touch on, I highlighted because it was the hero concept. John Quincy Adams, he was nicknamed the Hellhound of Slavery. He single-handedly led the fight to lift the gag rule which prohibited discussion of the slavery issue in Congress. When asked why he never seemed discouraged or depressed over championing such an unpopular fight, John Quincy Adams replied, "Duty is ours, results are God's." For me, that sums up pretty much everything. We have a duty, a job, to do a lot of things, but it is out of our hands what happens. The results are always God's. Whatever is going on with me is out of my hands. I have a job to do, but the results in the end belong to God. If a house is on fire, I have a job to do by sacrificing myself for somebody else. But ultimately, the result is God's. The Bible says, "Greater love hath no man than he lay his life down for his brother," or another man, or whatever, depending on the version of the Bible you read. But it's all the same in that sense. The struggle that I have with the thing that he said was being normal or being a hero. Being a Christian is where I have that struggle. I can see stepping out to not get in the middle of something. But if you know right from wrong and who's in the right and who's in the wrong, that's where I struggle. At some point, you have to lay down your life for something because we have a job. And in the end, the results are God's. They didn't know whether or not what they were doing, they knew the right thing to do was to end slavery, but whether they were going to win, they didn't know. They just knew that the results were in God's hands. And so just like us, we have a job to do, but the results are in God's hands. And so for me, that's where I kind of hung on to. With this hero thing, one of the major things that stuck out to me is kind of an odd one, but it's in Leviticus. Don't ask me how I ended up there, but I did. So it was Leviticus chapter 25. I had verses 42 and 43, and then 47 and 48. And I marked them both as heroes, but both of them talk about being servants. 42 says, "For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him with rigor, but you shall fear your God." When I talked about being a slave, whether it was a slave to fear, whether it was a slave to another person, a slave to alcohol, whatever it is, God said no matter what, we are His. We are His servant. We're not supposed to rule over each other with anything, but we're also not supposed to be a slave to anything else. Jumping to that, verse 47, it says, "If a sojourner or a stranger close to you becomes rich, and one of your brethren who dwells by him becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner close to you, or to a member of the stranger's family after he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brothers may redeem him." As brothers and sisters in Christ, our job is to be there for each other. And so when things like this happen, when we become a slave to something or someone, we do have the opportunity to help redeem that person from that situation. And we're supposed to. God calls us to do that. But the major thing that we have to look at is 1 Corinthians 7:23. We are bought with a price. God sent His Son to purchase us. He bought us with a price. And so because of that, we cannot be a slave to anything else. But we've allowed ourselves to. But He's asking us as fellow Christians to redeem each other from these situations, from being slaves to other things. I've sat here all day since this morning and then yesterday dwelling on this slavery thing. When I heard that, and as he talked to my son about our basic human right to protect ourselves, yet what do we call those who can't protect themselves? A slave. If we can't protect ourselves from fear, and we can't protect ourselves from anxiety or addiction or somebody else, all we are slaves. It has hit me like a ton of bricks that I could not figure out how to explain it, and that's how I learned what it was God was trying to tell me. I can't really put it into words, and I feel like I've taken a ton of time trying to explain it. This has been, I don't know, one of those harder, I want to say, lessons to kind of deal with for myself, I guess, because I've seen so many scriptures, and one of them was in Philemon chapter 1 verses 17 and 18, and it talks about whatever they had against Philemon to attach it to the writer, because for him it should have been wiped clean, and he was taking on that debt for himself. Forget whatever it was that he had done as a servant. He is now to be considered one of their fellow brethren. we often don't look at each other like that. If we've done something wrong, we still hold that over each other. We can't seem to let it go. But we're definitely not quick to be like, hey, if you see this person and they did this wrong, think about what they did and put it on me. We don't do that either. We don't want to take that burden. We don't want anybody looking at us taking whatever that sin was that they had and putting it on ourselves. We don't want to be associated with whatever sin it was. But he did that, and he told us to do likewise to others. We don't even come close to that. We're more like, God forgave him for that, because that's what Jesus died for. We're not even remotely going to take credit for somebody else's sin. So we allow somebody to fall to a slave state of mind to whatever their past was, to those fears and anxieties, to whatever it is that they're dealing with. And we just sit and we watch somebody start to fall. I've seen it. I deal with it on a daily basis myself. And it's awful. I don't know how to get out of it sometimes. I can't imagine what other people feel like that are in worse situations than me. My kind of end of this is, today's the first day of this year. Try to spend it breaking those chains of slavery to whatever it is you're bound to, that you don't think you're a slave to. Because whatever you cannot protect yourself from, those rampant thoughts of whatever, you're a slave to it. Get rid of it. And if you can't on your own, go to somebody. And if you're that person that somebody's coming to, take that burden on yourself, because that is our job as fellow Christians. We gotta stop allowing others to sit and try to deal with this stuff on their own, because we're just allowing them to become further into bondage. And we all were bought with the same price. And so we can't allow each other to succumb to this debt that has been paid already. And I'm struggling with it just as much on the first day of the new year. I am praying that this year is 10 times better than the last 2 years have been for me, that it's 10 times better for you guys as well. Pray, spend a few days fasting, whatever it is that you feel the Lord's leading you to do. I strongly encourage you to do it. I go back to work next week. The kids go back to school. It's going to be crazy, but I know this year has got to be better. I know the Lord's got great things in store, because it's been a wild last few months. So it's going to do something, and it can never be but for the good, because that's what God does, and it's all for His glory. So I thank you guys. Pray for me. I'm praying for you. It's a lot easier to pray for you than it is to pray for myself. So I hope you guys have a great year. I am going to get where I'm trying to post more. I've got some backup people pushing me. So that should definitely help me keep on track now. So I love you all, and God bless. Have a great weekend, and I will see you guys soon.